Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine waking up, not in your bed, not in your home, but in London. The year is 1348. It is early morning, and the city is already alive with sound. Bells are ringing from the church towers. Cart wheels are grinding over cobblestones. And somewhere, not too far away, someone is screaming. But before you can make sense of any of that, the smell hits you. It crashes into you like a wall. Something between rotting vegetables, animal dung, and something else. Something darker. Something you cannot quite name, but that settles in the back of your throat and refuses to leave. Welcome to medieval London. Welcome to the edge of the world's most devastating pandemic. And no, you would not survive a week. We talk about the Black Death in history lessons as though it is simply a number. 30 to 50% of Europe wiped out. 50 million dead. 2 million in England alone. But numbers are clean. They are tidy. They do not carry the weight of what those years truly felt like for the people living through them. So today, we are not talking about numbers. We are stepping inside the daily reality of a person alive during the Black Death, specifically into the world of hygiene, of dirt, of the body, and of everything that, without anyone knowing it at the time, was quietly feeding the catastrophe. To understand hygiene in 1348, you first have to understand how different the concept of cleanliness was. It was not that medieval people did not care about being clean. They did deeply, actually. But the entire framework through which they understood the human body, disease, and filth was built on a foundation that had almost nothing in common with what we know today. There were no germs in the medieval mind. There was no such thing as bacteria, no concept of viral transmission, no understanding of how microscopic organisms could travel from a flea to a rat to a human hand, and then into a bloodstream. What medieval people had instead were theories. Beautiful, logical, terrifyingly wrong theories. The dominant belief was the miasma theory. The idea that disease was carried in bad air. Foul-smelling air, rising from swamps, from rotting matter, from the earth itself in certain places, was thought to corrupt the body's internal balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If the air around you was putrid, your humors would fall out of alignment, your body would weaken, and illness would take hold. It sounds almost poetic, in a grim sort of way. And it explains so much about the choices people made. Choices that, from a modern perspective, seem baffling, sometimes darkly comic, and often heartbreaking. Now, step back into those London streets. The road beneath your feet, if you can call it a road, is a mixture of packed earth, animal waste, straw, discarded food, and human excrement. Because here is something we rarely sit with long enough to truly absorb. In 1348, there is no sewage system. There are open channels running through the middle of many streets, called kennels, and they carry everything. The butcher's blood, the tanner's chemical waste, the chamber pots emptied out of upper-story windows, with only a quick shout of, "Guard low, watch the water," as the only warning before the contents came raining down. If you were unlucky enough to be walking underneath, well, you would not be the first. The River Thames, which sounds so grand and historic, is at this time essentially an open sewer. Waste flows into it from every direction. Livestock are slaughtered on its banks. Bodies are sometimes thrown in, and yet, people drink from it. They cook with it. They wash their children's faces in it, because what choice do they have? The water from private wells is not much better, frequently contaminated by whatever is seeping through the ground from the middens. The great piles of household waste that sit just a few feet away from where people sleep. Let us talk about those homes for a moment. If you are a poor person in London in 1348, and most people are poor, you are likely living in a single room, or perhaps two, with your entire family. The floor is covered in rushes, which are dried reeds or grasses laid down to provide some insulation from the cold earth beneath. Sounds almost cozy, doesn't it? Except those rushes are rarely changed. They accumulate over months, sometimes years, layer upon layer, until they become a rich, compressed mat of old food scraps, animal droppings, spilled drink, dead insects, and general filth. Archaeologists who have studied medieval floor deposits have found them to be extraordinary ecosystems of decomposition. And living inside that ecosystem, thriving in the dark and the warmth, were fleas. Rat fleas, specifically. The very creatures that carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium of the Black Death. From host to host, silently, invisibly, relentlessly. The rats themselves were everywhere. Black rats, Rattus rattus, moved through the city like a shadow population, nesting in walls, in rooftops, in the holds of the merchant ships coming up the Thames from the continent. Nobody feared them especially. They were simply part of life, like the flies, and the lice, and the cockroaches. But when infected rats began dying in large numbers, which happened in the weeks before the plague truly erupted in a neighborhood, the fleas they carried had to find new hosts. And those new hosts were human. A single bite, barely noticed in the constant itching of daily medieval life, and the bacterium was inside you. Within days, your lymph nodes would begin to swell. First, a hard, painful lump under the arm, or in the groin, or along the neck. The dreaded bubo, black, swollen, exquisitely tender, and then the fever, and then for most, the end. But here is what makes the story of hygiene during the Black Death so unbearably tragic. People were not simply passive victims of their ignorance. They were trying. They were doing everything they believed would help, with tremendous effort and genuine fear. Take the matter of bathing. Public bathhouses, called stews, existed in medieval London, and they were popular. People went regularly, men and women, sometimes together in the same water. Bathing was considered pleasurable, and even healthy under normal circumstances. But when the plague arrived, physicians and scholars, using the miasma framework, began to warn people away from bathing. The logic was this: when you immerse yourself in hot water, your pores open, and if your pores are open, the bad air, the miasma, can enter your body more easily through the skin. So, in an attempt to protect themselves from plague, people began to bathe less. They sealed their homes, they blocked their windows, they stuffed rags into door gaps, and in doing so, they inadvertently created warmer, darker, more enclosed spaces where fleas and rats felt perfectly at home. The harder they tried to keep death out, the more efficiently they let it in. Wealthy Londoners had certain advantages, it is true. A merchant's wife might have access to clean linen, changed more frequently. Her household might boil drinking water, not because she understood germ theory, but because it was considered more refined, more digestible, simply a habit of elevated living. She might perfume her rooms with lavender and rosemary, clutch a pomander, a small ball of aromatic herbs and spices, to her nose when venturing into the streets, believing the sweet smell would counteract the poison in the air. And, accidentally, she may have been giving herself a small advantage, not because the herbs killed bacteria, but because the smell of the pomander kept her face slightly away from surfaces, made her less likely to touch her nose and mouth, kept others at a slight distance. The wealthy died, too, in great numbers, but not quite so fast, and not quite so many. The tiny margins of cleaner cloth, boiled water, and physical space added up to fractional statistical odds, and in a plague, fractions were everything. For the poor, those fractions were simply out of reach. A laborer sleeping 3 to a bed, on rushes, with pigs kept in the same building for warmth, with drinking water drawn from a well 10 feet from the midden. He had no pomander, no boiled water, no spare linen. He had his faith, his prayers, and the advice of those around him, which might include rubbing the buboes with a live chicken to draw out the poison, or drinking his own urine, or bleeding himself to rebalance the humors. None of it helped. None of it could. And the grief of that, the grief of watching your child, develop a swollen neck and knowing, with absolute certainty, that they are going to die, and doing everything you can think of, everything anyone has ever told you, and still watching them die. That grief is not a medieval grief. That is a human grief. It belongs to all of us. As the plague tightened its grip on London through the autumn of 1348 and into 1349, the social fabric of hygiene began to unravel in an entirely different way. It was no longer just about whether the streets were clean or the water was pure. It was about the rituals and the people who had kept collective cleanliness going. The gravediggers were dying, the priests were dying, the neighbors who would normally come to wash a body before burial, gone, so bodies began to pile up. In churchyards that were quickly overwhelmed, they dug great pits and layered the dead inside, without ceremony, without prayer, without the careful washing of the body that Christian tradition demanded. The smell of decomposition mixed with the smell of wood smoke from homes where families burned juniper and pine inside in desperate attempts to purify the air. London had become, in a very literal sense, a city of the dead that the living still had to move through, every single day. And what of the physicians? What of those entrusted with healing? A plague doctor of 1348, if you were fortunate enough to encounter one, would arrive in a costume that has become almost comically iconic. The long wax-covered robes, the wide-brimmed hat, the leather gloves, and above all, the beak, that long, curved, bird-like mask stuffed with aromatic herbs and dried flowers. Again, miasma theory at work. The beak was designed to filter bad air before it entered the doctor's lungs. The waxed clothing was meant to repel contaminated humors. And yet, in their bizarre, almost theatrical way, these suits provided a degree of real protection, not because of the herbs, but because the heavy leather and cloth reduced direct skin contact, reduced flea bites, kept bodily fluids at arm's length. These doctors were accidentally, imperfectly, doing something right. They just had no idea what it was or why. The Black Death finally began to loosen its grip on England by 1350, but it never truly left. It returned again in 1361, in 1369, and many times after that. And with each wave, the survivors carried not just their grief, but a slowly, gradually shifting understanding of the world. In the decades and centuries that followed, quarantine practices were developed. Isolation not as punishment, but as public health. Cities began to take greater responsibility for waste removal. The germ theory of disease, the real understanding of what had been happening all along, was still centuries away. But the seeds of it were planted, watered by catastrophe, by the sheer weight of so much preventable death. Here is the thing that stays with you after you sit with all of this. These were not ignorant people. They were not stupid, or careless, or primitive in the way we sometimes lazily imagine our ancestors to have been. They were people doing their absolute best with the understanding available to them. They loved their children. They feared death. They prayed and worked and tried. They just did not know. They could not have known. The information they needed to survive had not yet been discovered by anyone on Earth, and so they died, in their millions, surrounded by the smell of smoke and herbs and decay, holding each other's hands in the dark, believing that God had turned his face away from the world. So the next time you wash your hands, automatically, without thinking, reaching for the soap, remember that this simple act, this 30-second habit you perform a dozen times a day without a second thought, is the accumulated knowledge of centuries. It is the legacy of every plague doctor who suffocated inside a beaked mask, and every grieving mother who buried a child in an unmarked pit, and every scholar who asked, eventually, why the disease traveled the way it did. Clean hands are a form of memory, and the least we can do is remember.